the students of Hershey Middle School. 1. Brian Robson stared out the window of the small plane at the endless green northern wilderness below. There was a small plane, a Cessna 406, a bush plane, and the engine was so loud, roaring and consuming and loud, that it ruined any chance for conversation. Not that he had much to say. He was 13, and the only passenger on the plane was a pilot named, was it Jim or Jake or something, who was in his mid-40s and who had been silent as he worked to prepare for the takeoff. In fact, since Brian had come to the small airport in Hatchet, New York, to meet the plane driven by his mother, the pilot had only spoken 5 words to him. Get in the co-pilot seat. Which Brian had done. They had taken off, and that was the last of the conversation. There had been the initial excitement, of course. He had never flown in a single-engine plane before, and to be sitting in the co-pilot seat with all the controls right in front of him, all the instruments in his face as the plane crawled for altitude, jerking and sliding on the wind cones as the pilot took off, had been interesting and exciting. But in 5 minutes, they had leveled off at 6,000 feet and headed northwest, and from then on, the pilot had been silent, standing out the front, and the drone of the engine had been all that was left. The drone in the sea of green trees that lay before the plane's nose and flowed to the horizon, spread with lakes, swamps, and wandering streams and rivers. Now Brian sat, looking out the window with the roar thundering through his ears and trying to catalog what had led up to his taking this flight. The thinking started. All it started was with a single word, divorce. It was an ugly word, he thought, a tearing, ugly word that meant fights and yelling. Lawyers, God, he thought, how he hated lawyers who sat with their comfortable smiles and tried to explain to him in legal terms how all he lived in was coming apart, and the breaking and shattering of all the solid things. His home, his life, all the solid things, divorce, a breaking word, an ugly breaking word, divorce, secrets. No, not secrets so much as just the secret. What he knew, and had not told anybody what he knew about his mother that caused the divorce. What he knew, the secret, divorce, the secret. Brian felt his eyes beginning to burn and knew there would be tears. He had cried for a time, but that was gone now. He didn't cry now. Instead, his eye burned and tears came. His eyes with a finger and looked at the pilot out the corner of his eyes to make sure he hadn't noticed the burning and tears. The pilot sat large, his hands lightly on the wheel, feet on the rubber pedals. Seemed more a machine than a man, an extension of the plane. On the dashboard in front of him, Brian saw the dials, switches, meters, knobs, levers, cranks, lights, handles that were wiggling and flickering, all indicating nothing that he had understood, and the pilot seemed the same way. Part of the plane, not human. When he saw Brian look at him, the pilot seemed to open up a bit, and he smiled. Ever fly in the co-pilot seat before? He leaned over and lifted the headset off his right ear and put it to his temple, yelling to overcome the sound of the engine. Brian shook his head. He had never been in any kind of plane, never seen a cockpit of a plane except in films or television. It was loud and confusing. First time. It's not as complicated as it looks. A good plane like this almost flies itself, the pilot shrugged. Makes my job easy. He took Brian's left arm. Here, put your hands on the controls, the feet and the rubber pedals, and I'll show you what I mean. Brian shook his head. I'd better not. Sure, try it. Brian reached out and took the wheel and it gripped so tight his knuckles were white. He pushed his feet down on the pedals. The plane slid suddenly to the right. Not so hard. Take her right. Take her right. Brian eased off, relaxed his grip. The burning in his eyes was forgotten momentarily as the vibration of the plane came through the wheel and the pedals. It seemed almost alive. See? The pilot let go of his wheel, raised his hands in the air, and took his feet off the pedals to show Brian he was actually flying the plane along. Simple. Now turn the wheel away. To the right, and push on the right rudder pedal a small amount. Brian turned the wheel slightly, and the plane immediately banked to the right. And when he pressed on the right rubber wheel, the nose slid across the horizon to the right. He left off, and the pressure straightened the wheel, and the plane righted itself. Now you can turn. Bring her back to the left a little. Brian turned and the wheel left. He pushed on the easy, pushed on the left pedal, and the plane came back around. It's easy, he smiled. At least this part. The pilot nodded. All of the flying is easy. Just takes learning. Like everything else. Like everything else. He took the controls back, then reached up and rubbed his shoulder.
This is awesome.
Aches in the hands must be getting old. Brian let go of the controls and moved his feet away from the pedals as he put his hands on the wheel. Thank you. But the pilot had put his headset back on the gratitude was lost, and the engine noise and things went back to Brian, looking out the window of the ocean of trees and lakes. The burning eyes did not come back, but memories did, came flooding back. The words, always the words, the voice, the secret, flights, split, the big split. His father did not understand as Brian did. Only knew that Brian's mother wanted to break the marriage apart. The split had come, and then the divorce, all so fast, and the court had left him with his mother, except for the summons, what the judge called visitation rights. So formal. Brian hated judges that he hated lawyers. Judges that leaned on the bench and asked Brian if he understood where he was to live and why. Judges with a caring look that meant nothing as lawyers said legal phrases that meant nothing. In the summer, Brian would live with his father. In the school year with his mother. That's what the judge said after looking at the papers on his desk and listening to the lawyers talk, words. Now the plane lurched slightly to the right and Brian looked at the pilot. He was rubbing his shoulder again and there was the sudden smell of body gas in the plane. Brian turned back to avoid embarrassing the pilot, who was obviously in some discomfort, must have stomach troubles. So this summer, the first summer, when he was allowed to have visitation rights with his father, with the divorce only 1 month old, Brian was heading north. His father was a mechanical engineer who had designed or invented a new drill for oil drilling, a self-cleaning, self-sharpening bit. He was working in the oil fields of Canada, up on the tree line where the tundra started, and the forests ended. Brian was riding up to New York with some drilling equipment. It was lashed down in the rear of the plane next to a fabric bag the pilot had called a survival pack, which had emergency supplies in case they had to make an emergency landing. That had to be specially made in the city, riding in the bush plane with a pilot named Jim or Jake or something, who had turned out to be an all-right guy, letting him fly more. Except for the smell. Now there was a constant odor, and Brian took another look at the pilot, found him rubbing the shoulder, up and down, the arm now, the left arm, letting go more gas and listen. Probably something he ate, Brian thought. His mother had driven him from the city to meet the plane at Hampton, where it came to pick up the drilling equipment. A drive in silence, a long drive in silence. 2.5 hours of sitting in the car, staring out the window of the plane. Once, after an hour, when they were out of the city, she turned to him. Look, can't we talk this over? Can't we talk this out? Can't you tell me what's bothering you? And there were the words again, divorce, split, the secret. How could he tell her what he knew? So he had remained silent, shook his head and continued to stare, the unseen, at the countryside. And his mother had gone back to driving, only to speak to him once more. One more time, when they were close to Hampton. She reached over the back of the seat and brought up a paper sack. I've got something for you for the trip. Brian took the sack and opened the top. Inside there was a hatchet, the kind with a steel handle and the rubber hand grip. The head was in a stout leather case that had a brass riveted belt loop. It goes on your belt, his mother spoke without looking at him. There were some farm trucks on the road now, and she had to weave through them and watch traffic. A man at the store said you can use it, in the woods with your father. Dad. Not my father, my dad. Thanks, it's really nice. But the words sounded hollow, even to Brian. Try it on. See how it looks on your belt. And he would normally have said no, that it looked too hokey to have a hatchet on your belt. Those were the normal things he would say, but her voice was thin, had a sound like something thin would break if you touch it. And he felt bad for speaking to her. Knowing what he knew, even with the anger, the hot white hate of his anger at her, he still felt bad for not speaking to her. And so, to humor her, he loosened his belt and put the right side out and put the hatchet on the red thread belt. Scooch around so I can see. He moved around in the seat, feeling only slightly ridiculous. She nodded, just like a scout, my little scout. And there was a tenderness in her voice that she had when he was small, the tenderness that she had when he was small and sick with a cold, and she put her hand on his forehead, and the burning came into his eyes again, and he had turned away from her and looked out the window, forgetting the hatchet on his belt, and so arrived at the plane, the hatchet still on the belt. Because it was a bush flight from a small airport, there had been no security, and the plane had been waiting with the engine running when he arrived, and he had grabbed his suitcase and pack bag and run for the plane without stopping to remove the hatchet. So it was still on his belt. At first, he had been embarrassed, but the pilot had said nothing about it, and Brian forgot it as easy as he took off and began flying. More smell now. Bad. Brian turned again to glance at the pilot, who had both hands on his stomach and was grimacing in pain, reaching for the left shoulder again as Brian watched. "Don't know, kid," the pilot's words were a hiss, barely audible. "Bad aches here, bad aches. Thought it was something I ate, but..." He stopped as a fresh spasm of pain hit him. Even Brian could see how bad it was. The pain drove the pilot back into the seat, back and down. "I've never had anything like this." The pilot reached for the switch on his mic cord, his hand coming out in a small arc from his stomach, and he flipped the switch and said, "This is Flight 46. And now a jolt took him in a hammer blow, so forcefully that he seemed to crush back into the seat, and Brian reached for him. Could not understand at first what it was, could not know. And then he knew. Brian knew. The pilot's mouth was rigid. He swore and jerked a short series of slams into the seat, holding his shoulder now. Swore and hissed. "Chest! Oh God, my chest is coming apart." Brian knew now. The pilot was having a heart attack. Brian had been in the shopping mall with his mother when a man in front of Paisley's store had suffered a heart attack. He had gone down and screamed about his chest. An old man, much older than the pilot. Brian knew. The pilot was having a heart attack, and even as the knowledge came to Brian, he saw the pilot slam into the seat one more time. One more awful time he slapped back into the seat, and his right leg jerked, pulling the plane to the side, and sudden twists, and the head fell forward, and spit came. Spit came from the corners of his mouth, and his legs contracted up into the seat, and his eyes rolled back into his head until they were only white for his eyes, and the smell became worse. Filled the cockpit, and all of it so fast, so incredibly fast, that Brian's mind could not take it in at first. Could only see it in stages. The pilot had been talking just a moment ago, complaining of the plane. He had been talking. Then the jolts had come. The jolts that took the pilot back had come, and now Brian sat, and there was a strange feeling of silence in the throbbing roar of the engine. A strange feeling of silence and being alone. Brian was stopped. He was stopped. Inside, he was stopped. He could not think past what he saw, what he felt. All was stopped. The very core of him, the very center of Brian Robeson, was stopped and stricken with a white flash of horror, a terror so intense that his breathing, his thinking, and nearly his heart stopped. Seconds passed, seconds that became all of his life, and to know what he was seeing, began to understand what he saw. That was worse, so much worse, that he wanted to make his mind freeze again. He was sitting in a bush plane roaring 7,000 feet above the northern wilderness with a pilot who had suffered a massive heart attack and who was either dead or in something worse or close to a coma. He was alone. In the roaring plane with no pilot, he was alone. Alone. Chapter 2. For a time that he could not understand, Brian could do nothing. Even after his mind began working and he could see what had happened, he could do nothing. It was as if his hands and his arms were red. Then he looked for ways for it to not have happened. Be asleep, his mind screamed at the pilot. Just be asleep and your eyes will open and your hands will take the controls and your feet will move to the pedals, but it did not happen. The pilot did not move except Then his head rolled on the neck impossibly released as the pilot hit a small bit of turbulence. The plane. Somehow the plane was still flying. Seconds had passed, nearly a minute, and the plane flew on as if nothing had happened until he had to do something, but did not know what. Help. He had to help. He stretched one hand toward the pilot, saw that his fingers were trembling, and touched the pilot on the chest. He did not know what to do. He knew there were no procedures that you could do mouth-to-mouth on victims of heart attacks and push chest, CPR, but he did not know how to do it, and in any case could not do it with the pilot, who was sitting in the seat and still strapped in with his seatbelt. So he touched the pilot with the tips of his fingers, touched him on the chest, and could feel nothing, no heartbeat, no rise and fall of breathing, which meant the pilot was almost certainly dead. Please, Barry said, but did not know what or who to ask. Please. The plane lurched again, hit more turbulence, and Brian felt the nose drop. He did not die, but the nose went down slightly, and the down angle increased the speed. And he knew, at this angle, the slight angle down, he would ultimately fly into the trees. He could see them ahead on the horizon, where before he could only see. He had to fly it somehow. He had to fly the plane. He had to help himself. The pilot was gone, beyond anything he could do. He had to try and fly that plane. He turned back in the seat, facing the front, and put his hands, still trembling, on the control wheel, his feet gently on the rudder pedals. You could pull back on the stick to raise the plane, he knew from reading. You could always pull back from the wheel. He gave it a tug and it slid back toward him easily, too easily. The plane, with the increased speed from the tilt down, swooped eagerly down and drove Brian's stomach down. He pushed the wheel back in, went too far this time, and the plane's nose went below the horizon, and the engine speed increased with the shallow dive. Too much. He pulled back again, more gently this time, and the nose floated up again, too far, but not as violently as before. Then down a bit too much, and then up again as before. Then down a bit too much, and up again, very easily, and in front of the plane, cowling settled. When he had it aimed at the horizon, and it seemed to be steady, he held the wheel where it was, let out his breath, which he had been holding all this time, and tried to think of what to do next. It was a clear blue sky, with fluffy bits of clouds here and there, and he looked out at the window for a moment, hoping to see something, a town or a village, but there was nothing, just the green of the trees, endless green. The lake scattered more and more thickly as the plane flew. Where? He was flying but did not know where. He had no idea where he was going. He looked at the dashboard of the plane, studied the dials, and hoped to get some help, hoped to find a compass. But it was all so confusing, a jumble of numbers and lights. One lighted display in the top center of the dashboard said the number 342. Another next to it said 22. Down beneath there were dials with lines that seemed to indicate what the winds were doing, tipping or moving, and one dial with a needle pointing to the number 70, which he only thought might be the alternator. The device told him his height above the ground, or above sea level. Somewhere he had read something about altimeters, but he couldn't remember what, or where, or anything about them. Slightly to the left, and below the altimeter, he saw a small rectangular panel with a lighted dial and 2 knobs. His eyes had passed it over 2 or 3 times before he saw what was written in tiny letters on top of the panel. Transmitter 221 was stamped in the metal, and it hit him finally that it was the radio. The radio, of course. He had to use the radio. When the pilot had been hit that way, he couldn't bring himself to say the pilot was dead. He couldn't think it. He had been trying to use the radio. Brian looked at the pilot. The headset was still on his head, turned sideways a bit from his jamming back into the seat, and the microphone switch was clipped into his belt. Brian had to get the headset from the pilot. Had to reach over and get the headset from the pilot, or he would not be able to use the radio to call for help. He had to reach over. His hands began trembling again. He did not want to touch the pilot, did not want to reach for him, but he had to. He had to get the radio. He lifted his hands from the wheel just slightly and held them, waiting to see what would happen. The plane flew on normally, smoothly. All right, he thought. Now to do this thing. He turned and reached for the headset.